The shrill wail of the ambulance siren sliced through the pristine air of Willow Creek Estates, a sound as unwelcome as a rogue dandelion on Karen's meticulously manicured lawn. Inside the ambulance, Rick, a paramedic with a wit sharper than a scalpel, muttered, "Here we go again. Another crisis in Sylvania." His partner, Sarah, a seasoned veteran who could handle a cardiac arrest and a screaming toddler simultaneously, simply sighed. "Just try not to antagonize the natives, Rick. Remember what happened last time with the misplaced garbage can?" They screeched to a halt in front of a mansion that could comfortably house a small European country. Mr. Thompson, the neighborhood's resident millionaire and purveyor of questionable fashion choices, was slumped on the porch, clutching his chest like he was auditioning for a heart attack commercial. Rick and Sarah sprang into action, hooking Mr. Thompson up to monitors and barking medical jargon like seasoned pros. His heart rhythm looked like a Jackson Pollock painting, chaotic and unpredictable. "He's going into VTACH. We need to transport now," Rick shouted, as Sarah wrestled the gurney out of the ambulance. They loaded Mr. Thompson into the back. Rick jumped in to continue the life-saving tango, and Sarah was about to floor it when, "Hold it right there," the voice, high-pitched and dripping with righteous indignation, could curdle milk at 50 paces. Rick groaned inwardly. It was her. Standing in the driveway, arms akimbo and face a mask of suburban fury, was Karen, president of the HOA, ruler of the cul-de-sac, and champion of pointless rules. Her hair, a gravity-defying edifice of blonde ambition, seemed to vibrate with indignation. "What in the name of Martha Stewart do you think you're doing, blocking my driveway?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the perfectly symmetrical houses. "I have a luncheon at the country club, and I refuse to be late because of your flagrant disregard for parking regulations." Sarah, ever the diplomat, tried to reason with the suburban Cerberus. "Ma'am, this is an emergency. Mr. Thompson is having a heart attack. We need to get him to the hospital." Karen's eyes narrowed. "A heart attack? Well, that's hardly my problem, is it? There's a perfectly good fire lane right over there." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger towards a non-existent fire lane. "And besides, he should have invested in a stair lift. It's simply inconsiderate to have a medical emergency in front of someone's driveway." Rick, his patience wearing thinner than Karen's social skills, couldn't resist. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we're trying to save a life here. Your luncheon can wait. Unless, of course, they're serving heart attacks on a platter." Karen gasped, clutching her pearls. Probably faux, Rick suspected. "How dare you speak to me like that? I am the president of this HOA. I have connections. I'll have you both fired and your ambulance impounded. Do you know who Mr. Thompson is?" "Yes," Rick deadpanned. "He's the guy currently trying not to die in the back of our illegally parked ambulance." He glanced at the monitor, where Mr. Thompson's heart rhythm was doing a jitterbug. "And right now, your parking tirade is significantly increasing his chances of succeeding." Karen, momentarily stunned by Rick's audacity, sputtered, "Well, he should have considered the consequences before having a medical emergency. This is a gated community, not some kind of ambulance free-for-all." As Sarah finally managed to navigate the ambulance around Karen's sputtering form, Rick knew that this encounter was far from over. He had just poked the bear, and this bear was armed with bylaws, a minivan, and a whole lot of pent-up passive aggression. The ambulance careened towards the hospital, sirens wailing like banshees at a karaoke night. In the back, Rick managed to stabilize Mr. Thompson, whose heart, bless its resilient little ticker, had decided to rejoin the party. "You okay, Mr. Thompson?" Rick asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Mr. Thompson, pale but surprisingly chipper, winked. "Never better, Rick. Though I must say that Karen certainly knows how to make a dramatic entrance. She's like a one-woman HOA apocalypse." At the hospital, Mr. Thompson was whisked away for further treatment, leaving Rick to ponder the Karen situation. She had crossed a line. She had disrespected the sanctity of a medical emergency, and, more importantly, she had threatened his job. It was time for payback, but Rick wasn't about to resort to anything illegal. He was a paramedic, Not a criminal mastermind, though he did have a few ideas involving superglue and leaf blowers. The next day, Rick received an unexpected call. It was Mr. Thompson, sounding suspiciously energetic for a man who had nearly kicked the bucket just hours earlier. "Rick, my boy, I heard what happened with that she-devil," Mr. Thompson chuckled. "She's been terrorizing this neighborhood for years. It's time someone taught her a lesson. And I have a plan." Mr. Thompson, it turned out, was a connoisseur of petty revenge. He had spent years observing Karen's behavior, cataloging her every flaw and obsession. He knew exactly how to push her buttons, and he was willing to share his arsenal of HOA-approved torture with Rick. "I want you to become my agent of chaos, Rick," Mr. Thompson said, his voice dripping with mischievous glee. "I want you to use the HOA bylaws against her, turn her own weapons against her, make her life a living, breathing suburban nightmare." Rick, initially hesitant, found himself drawn in by Mr. Thompson's infectious enthusiasm. Besides, the thought of unleashing a little bit of chaos into Karen's perfectly ordered world was undeniably appealing. Rick's first target, Karen's prized petunias. According to HOA Bylaw 37B, subsection 4, paragraph 2, all petunias must be uniform in color and height. Karen's petunias, while undeniably vibrant, were a riot of different hues and sizes. Rick, armed with a measuring tape and a color chart, meticulously documented each violation and filed a formal complaint with the HOA. The complaint, written in excruciatingly precise legal jargon, courtesy of Mr. Thompson, accused Karen of gross negligence in the horticultural arts and demanded the immediate removal of the offending petunias. Rick even included photographic evidence, complete with annotations and arrows pointing out the various infractions. Next on the list, Karen's lawn ornaments. HOA Bylaw 42, subsection 8, paragraph 7, stated that lawn ornaments must not exceed 18 inches in height and must be of a tasteful and understated nature. Karen's collection of lawn gnomes, on the other hand, were both garish and enormous. They were also strategically placed to maximize their offensive potential. Rick, armed with a ruler and a camera, documented each gnome's height and level of tackiness. He then filed another complaint, accusing Karen of visual pollution and demanding the immediate removal of the offending garden ghouls. He even included a sketch of a more tasteful and understated lawn ornament, a single minimalist rock. But Rick's masterpiece was his complaint regarding Karen's mailbox cover. HOA Bylaw 51, subsection 3, paragraph 9, stated that mailbox covers must be of a neutral color and must not contain any offensive or distracting imagery. Karen's mailbox cover, on the other hand, was a garish monstrosity adorned with glitter, sequins, and a disturbingly lifelike image of her own face. Rick, armed with a thesaurus and a sense of righteous indignation, crafted a complaint so scathing, so eloquent, so utterly devastating, that it could bring a grown HOA president to tears. He accused Karen of egregious self-aggrandizement, visual assault, and a flagrant disregard for the aesthetic sensibilities of the community. He even suggested that her mailbox cover was a threat to national security. Within days, the HOA had launched a full-scale investigation into Karen's various violations. She was bombarded with letters, phone calls, and emails demanding that she rectify the situation immediately. She was forced to remove her petunias, banish her gnomes, and replace her mailbox cover with something slightly less terrifying. Karen, predictably, was not amused. She suspected Rick of being behind the campaign of harassment, but she couldn't prove it. And that, Rick realized, was the beauty of his plan. He was operating within the confines of the HOA bylaws. He was simply upholding the rules, enforcing the regulations, and bringing a little bit of justice to a community that desperately needed it. Karen was losing it. The HOA investigation, fueled by Rick's meticulous complaints, had turned her life into a living hell. Her prized petunias, now replaced by a row of uniformly bland impatiens, mocked her from their flower beds. Her beloved gnomes, exiled to the dark recesses of her garage, haunted her dreams. And her mailbox cover, now a dull, beige monstrosity, was a constant reminder of her humiliation. Sleep became a luxury she could no longer afford. She tossed and turned, plagued by nightmares of rogue lawn gnomes and vengeful petunias. The once pristine walls of her home seemed to close in on her, whispering accusations of horticultural malpractice and aesthetic terrorism. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her, and she knew who was responsible. Rick, that meddling paramedic with his smug smile and his encyclopedic knowledge of HOA bylaws. He was the architect of her downfall, the puppet master behind the suburban chaos. But Karen wasn't about to go down without a fight. She was the president of the HOA. Damn it. She had power, influence, and a Rolodex full of disgruntled neighbors. She would crush Rick like a weed in her meticulously manicured lawn. Karen's first act of retaliation was to unleash the full force of the HOA's bureaucratic might upon Rick. She scoured the bylaws, looking for any possible infraction, any excuse to fine him, harass him, or, preferably, evict him from the community altogether. She started with his lawn. According to HOA Bylaw 63, subsection 12, paragraph 5, lawns must be maintained at a height of no more than 2.5 inches. Rick's lawn, while perfectly healthy and green, was a mere quarter of an inch above the legal limit. Karen, armed with a ruler and a pair of gardening shears, descended upon Rick's property, determined to bring him to justice. She measured every blade of grass, meticulously documenting each infraction. She even took photographs, complete with close-ups and dramatic lighting. The resulting fine was exorbitant, a whopping $500 for gross negligence in lawn maintenance. Rick, however, simply chuckled and paid the fine. He knew that Karen was playing right into his hands. Next, Karen targeted Rick's garbage cans. According to HOA Bylaw 72, subsection 4, paragraph 8, garbage cans must be stored out of sight from the street and must not be visible from any neighboring property. Rick's garbage cans, while neatly tucked away behind his garage, were technically visible from Karen's second-story window. Karen, armed with a pair of binoculars and a deep-seated sense of entitlement, spent hours spying on Rick's property, documenting the precise angle at which his garbage cans became visible. She then filed another complaint, demanding that Rick construct a garbage can concealment structure that would completely block his bins from view. Rick, again, complied. He built a magnificent structure out of reclaimed wood and recycled materials, complete with a living roof and a built-in bird feeder. It was so beautiful, in fact, that Karen was forced to admit, grudgingly, that it was an improvement over the original garbage cans. Karen's obsession with Rick escalated to new levels of absurdity. She began monitoring his every move, tracking his comings and goings, scrutinizing his lifestyle, and generally making his life a living hell. She filed noise complaints about his early morning ambulance runs, accusing him of disturbing the peace and causing emotional distress to the neighborhood's pampered poodles. She filed parking complaints about his ambulance, claiming that it was unsightly and detracted from the aesthetic appeal of the community. She even filed a complaint about his Christmas decorations, arguing that they were excessive, tacky, and a blatant violation of the spirit of the season. Rick, however, remained unfazed. He treated Karen's harassment with a mixture of amusement and contempt. He knew that she was simply lashing out, desperately trying to regain control of her crumbling empire. But Karen's actions were beginning to alienate her from the rest of the community. Her constant complaints and her increasingly erratic behavior were turning her into a pariah. Even her most loyal supporters were starting to question her sanity. The final straw came during the HOA's annual holiday party. Karen, determined to reassert her authority and remind everyone who was boss, decided to deliver a speech. She started by reciting a litany of grievances, complaining about the lack of holiday spirit, the unsightly decorations, and the general decline of community standards. She then launched into a tirade against Rick, accusing him of being a menace to society, a disruptor of the peace, and a threat to the very fabric of our community. But as she ranted and raved, her composure began to unravel. Her carefully constructed facade crumbled, revealing the bitter, insecure, and utterly unhinged woman beneath. She screamed. She sobbed. She waved her arms wildly. She accused Rick of everything from planting subliminal messages in the neighborhood's irrigation system to conspiring with the local squirrels to undermine her authority. The guests, initially shocked and embarrassed, began to snicker. Some even started to record the spectacle on their phones. Karen's reign of terror was coming to an end. The video of Karen's meltdown went viral. It was shared, retweeted, and memed to oblivion. Karen became an overnight sensation, a symbol of suburban entitlement and the absurdity of HOA culture. The HOA, fearing further embarrassment, called an emergency meeting and voted to remove Karen from her position as president. She was stripped of her power, her influence, and her dignity. As she was escorted from the premises, she glared at Rick, her eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over," she hissed. "I'll get you for this, Rick. You haven't seen the last of me." Rick simply smiled. "I highly doubt that, Karen. But if you do decide to make a comeback, just remember to check the bylaws first. And maybe lay off the Pinot Grigio." With Karen gone, the HOA began to dismantle her draconian rules and regulations. The community began to breathe again. People started to smile, to laugh, to decorate their lawns with whatever they pleased. A new era of suburban sanity had dawned, and Rick, the reluctant hero, had played a crucial role in bringing it about. Willow Creek Estates was eerily calm after Karen's spectacular implosion. The HOA, now under the sane leadership of a retired accountant named Mildred, was busy undoing the damage, repealing the most ridiculous bylaws, and generally trying to rehabilitate the community's image. Rick, basking in the afterglow of his mostly accidental heroism, found himself a local celebrity. Neighbors, who had once avoided him like the plague, now greeted him with smiles and waves. He even received a fruit basket from the notoriously grumpy Mrs. Henderson, who had previously threatened to report him for excessive leaf blowing. But beneath the surface of suburban tranquility, something was brewing. Karen, banished from the kingdom, was not gone, not forgotten. She was lurking in the shadows, plotting her comeback, her mind a swirling vortex of bitterness and revenge. One sunny afternoon, Rick received an unexpected invitation. It was from Mr. Thompson, inviting him to a small celebratory gathering at his mansion. Rick, curious and slightly apprehensive, decided to attend. The party was surprisingly low-key. A few neighbors mingled awkwardly around the pool, sipping lemonade and making small talk about the weather. Mr. Thompson, however, was nowhere to be seen. As Rick was about to leave, he was summoned to Mr. Thompson's study. The room was a monument to excess, filled with rare books, priceless artifacts, and a disconcerting number of Hawaiian shirts. Mr. Thompson, sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, greeted Rick with a sly smile. "Ah, Rick, my boy, glad you could make it. Have a seat." Rick sat down, feeling a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. Something was off. Mr. Thompson's eyes had a glint of mischief, a hint of something more than just friendly gratitude. "I wanted to thank you, Rick," Mr. Thompson said, his voice smooth as silk. "You did a great job with Karen. You really stirred things up. You brought this community to life." Rick shifted uncomfortably. "I just did what I thought was right, Mr. Thompson. She was out of control." "Oh, I know," Mr. Thompson chuckled. "That's why I needed someone like you. Someone who wasn't afraid to challenge her. Someone who wasn't afraid to get their hands dirty." He paused, leaning forward conspiratorially. "You see, Rick, Karen wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was a symptom of a much larger problem. A problem of complacency, of apathy, of suburban stagnation." Rick frowned. "I'm not sure I follow you, Mr. Thompson." Mr. Thompson smiled, a predatory glint in his eye. "Let me explain. I've been watching this community for years, Rick. I've seen it slowly decay, become a bland, soulless wasteland. I needed to shake things up, to inject a little bit of chaos into the system." He paused for dramatic effect. "So, I decided to orchestrate a little social experiment. I knew that Karen was the perfect catalyst. She was the embodiment of everything that was wrong with this community. All I needed was someone to light the fuse. Rick stared at Mr. Thompson, his mind reeling. Are you saying you planned all of this? You faked your heart attack? You manipulated Karen? You used me? Mr. Thompson shrugged. Let's just say I created an opportunity. You were the one who seized it. You were the one who turned it into a revolution. Rick was stunned. He had been a pawn in Mr. Thompson's elaborate game, an unwitting participant in his twisted social experiment. He felt betrayed, used, and incredibly stupid. Why? Rick demanded, his voice trembling with anger. Why would you do this? What was the point? Mr. Thompson sighed, his smile fading. Because Rick, this community needed a wake-up call. It needed to remember what it meant to be alive, to be engaged, to be passionate. And sometimes the only way to do that is to create a little bit of chaos. He paused, his eyes pleading. I know it sounds crazy, Rick, but I did it for the good of the community. And I think deep down you know that too. Rick wasn't convinced. He still felt betrayed, manipulated, and deeply uneasy. But he couldn't deny that Mr. Thompson had a point. Willow Creek Estates had been a stagnant, soulless place, and Karen's reign of terror, however misguided, had forced people to wake up, to engage, to fight for what they believed in. So what now? Rick asked, his voice resigned. What do you want me to do? Mr. Thompson smiled, his eyes regaining their mischievous glint. I want you to join me, Rick. I want you to help me shape this community into something truly special. Something truly extraordinary. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I want you to run for president of the HOA. Rick stared at Mr. Thompson, speechless. Run for president of the HOA? It was the most absurd, the most ridiculous, the most tempting offer he had ever received. He could embrace the chaos, become Mr. Thompson's partner in crime, and reshape Willow Creek Estates in their own twisted image. He could wield the power of the HOA, rewrite the bylaws, and create a community where eccentricity was celebrated, where individuality was encouraged, and where Karen's reign of terror was nothing more than a distant memory. But at what cost? Could he trust Mr. Thompson? Could he stomach the idea of becoming a puppet master himself, manipulating people for his own amusement? Was he willing to sacrifice his own integrity, his own sense of right and wrong, for the sake of suburban utopia? Rick looked out the window at the manicured lawns, the perfectly symmetrical houses, the eerily calm streets. He thought of Karen, lurking in the shadows, plotting her revenge. He thought of Mr. Thompson, sitting beside him, a puppet master with a heart of gold, or perhaps a heart of something slightly less reputable. He knew that he had a choice to make, a choice that would define his future, his community, and, perhaps, his very soul. He took a deep breath and turned to Mr. Thompson, a mischievous glint in his own eyes. All right, Mr. Thompson, he said, a sly smile spreading across his face. Let's see if we can make this HOA thing a little more interesting. And so the game continued. The battle for Willow Creek Estates was far from over. The players had changed, the stakes had been raised, and the rules, as always, were subject to change. But one thing was certain. In the twisted world of suburbia, revenge was a dish best served with a side of perfectly manicured lawn clippings and a whole lot of HOA-approved absurdity.